He did not arrive as a whisper in the warp, nor as a figure lost in time. He arrived with blood still drying on his knuckles, with a smile that made devils flinch, and eyes that saw through every god's lie. Gojo Satoru, the man who could bend infinity, who laughed in the face of curses and stood at the apex of a world that once called itself magical, now stood beneath a red sky that had no horizon, where Terra's towers clawed at the heavens and demon worlds wept in chains of brass and hate. This was not his world, but neither was it Angron's anymore. The Primarch of the World Eaters no longer bled for anything human. He was rage shaped into bone and iron. He was butcher's nails buried so deep they sang hymns of madness. And the moment Gojo blinked, the moment the sky turned, they saw each other. Two storms, one bound by suffering, the other by choice, and the galaxy would scream to see which broke first. But before fists shattered reality, before techniques burned through time, there would be a moment between infinity and wrath, when gods paused, not because they feared the outcome, but because for the first time in 10,000 years, they didn't know who would win. If this is your kind of madness, if you live for impossible duels, broken universes, and the questions no one dares ask, then like, share, and subscribe. These aren't just battles, these are myths being rewritten. And you're here to witness every scream of it. The warp was not calm, it never was. It churned, howled, thrashed like a caged beast gnawing at the skin of reality, but this time it recoiled, not in fury, but in something far rarer: confusion. Even the most ancient of demons, beings who had mocked the rise and fall of empires, blinked their formless eyes and paused their endless games. Because something had entered, not through a breach, not through a ritual, not even by the decree of chaos. It simply arrived, like a splinter of unreason driven into a madman's skull. The fabric of the Eye of Terror bent inward around a singular presence. There were no ripples, no warp storms, just a moment where time hesitated, where unreality hiccuped, and in the bleeding void of a dying sector, on a fractured asteroid of brass and bone long abandoned by the word-bearers, he opened his eyes. Gojo Satoru stood still, white hair catching the windless current of atmosphere that had no right to exist. Blindfold now faded into a band of shimmering null light. His uniform was torn but untouched by dirt. The runes etched into the stones beneath him fizzled and died in his presence, like parasites starved by something that refused to be part of this ecosystem. He was not a psyker, not a demon, not a son of Terra, and the warp didn't know what to do with him. Behind him, the stars bled. Real space was fractured where he had come through, a needle-thin thread of resonance still fading behind his spine. The portal he'd created, no, not created, willed, had closed without a scream, and that was what made it worse. Nothing entered the warp quietly, nothing left that peacefully. But he had. His boots crunched over powdered bone as he stepped forward into the gravity field of this half-corpse world. Mechanicum glyphs carved into the mountainside sparked and failed, unable to quantify what his presence meant. This was a domain where language was screamed, not spoken, where logic had long since been abandoned in favor of devotion, and devotion had turned into rot. And yet Gojo simply stood there, arms in pockets, gaze forward. He knew, he always knew, this place, this wasn't home. But wherever he went, the rules bent around him. Bent, but never broke, because he decided what broke. Gojo tilted his head to the side. His 6 eyes, veiled but active, scanned the terrain, the warp signatures, the tectonic pulses, like reading air currents for danger. But what drew his attention wasn't the madness of this plane. It was the silence. He'd lived among screams. Demons of sorrow, entities that clawed at the seams of existence with grief and hatred. He'd faced loss more than once, buried students, killed friends, but this place, it was a scream without voice. It felt like something had been crying for 10,000 years and had simply given up. He knelt, picked up a shard of metallic bone, ancient, marked with high Gothic scripture, melted halfway through. Probably once part of a Skitaria unit, its surface was covered in brass, not natural rust, not from time, from blood rituals, from devotion to something monstrous. Gojo closed his fist over it, and for the first time since he crossed over, he whispered, "Not pretty." And far away on a demon world orbiting a black sun, Angron looked up. The Butcher of New Syria had felt many things in his long damnation. Betrayal, rage, ecstasy, and slaughter, indifference from the gods he served. But he had never felt this. It wasn't a challenge, not yet. It wasn't a beckoning from a rival champion of Khorne. It wasn't even one of the Emperor's lapdogs clawing at the edges of his dominion. It was something new, something that did not kneel, not to warp, not to will, not even to physics. The nails buried in Angron's skull began to twitch, not from pain, from curiosity. It was a feeling he hated more than anything. It made him remember. And far above where the warp bled into Mandeville points and the Mechanicus dared not look, one inquisitorial ship flagged a signal, a singularity spike, impossible readings. The pilot went mad before finishing the Vox report, whispering about light that refused to decay. A tech priest recorded the resonance pattern, spoke a prayer to the Omnissiah, and locked the data in Vault Seal under Holy Cipher 9. The pattern was marked, not warp, not null, not Xeno, unknown class, potential threat, level Omega. And still, Gojo walked. A cult of chaos acolytes emerged from the cracks of the ruined asteroid, starved, half-morphed. Blades made from servo wires and flesh. They chanted in languages Gojo didn't care to learn. They called him False God. He replied with silence. The first attacker rushed, didn't finish the first step. A flick of the wrist, a turn of space. The body folded into a crescent of red and was gone. No impact, no echo, just a missing presence. The rest didn't scream, not because they were brave, but because they died before their lungs remembered how. Gojo exhaled slowly. "Right," he muttered. "Still works here." But somewhere deeper inside, beneath his calm, beneath the confidence he wore like a second skin, he felt it. This place didn't welcome him. It didn't reject him either. It simply waited, as if the world knew something was coming. And it did for every piece Gojo disrupted in this mad puzzle of a universe. Something else adjusted in turn, and a name began to form in the warp wind. A name not spoken in reverence, but in warning. Angron. The air around Angron was never still, even in the rare moments when there was no slaughter, no enemy, no scream of bolter or chainaxe. The world trembled with him. The very ground of his domain, a demon-forged world of brass and black glass, seemed to quiver under his existence. It was not fear, it was resonance. The planet bled for him because it was him. Every inch of its molten surface pulsed with the rhythm of the butcher's nails. Every sound, every heartbeat that was not his was swallowed by that endless metallic gnawing at the edges of his mind. A chorus of violence so constant that silence itself had become alien. And yet, there was silence now. He felt it like a blade to the skull. It was not peace, it was intrusion. Something had entered the weave of the warp, not as a storm or a god's whisper, but as an absence, an emptiness that did not belong here. The nails inside his head stuttered once. And in that flicker, Angron remembered what it was to think without pain. The sensation enraged him. He tore his axe from the carcass of a demon that had dared interrupt his solitude. The weapon's teeth were still wet with ichor, each one carved from the bones of the Great Crusade's victims. It purred like an animal eager for more, sensing its master's unease. Around him, the Legion of the Lost knelt, mortal warbands, demunkin, echoes of world-eaters who no longer remembered what it meant to be human. They worshipped him as Khorne's will made flesh. He hated them for it. "Speak!" he snarled, his voice like a furnace cracking stone. A mortal champion crawled forward, a man little more than a skeleton wrapped in ritual scars. "Lord of Rage, something tears at the veil. We feel it in the blood. The warp recoils." Angron bent down. His breath was hot enough to peel the man's flesh. "Then bleed for it." The mortal obeyed, slashing his own throat in silent devotion. The blood spilled upward, defying gravity, twisting into symbols that shimmered before collapsing into nothing. No answer, no vision from Khorne, only that maddening stillness. And beneath it, like a whisper under the roar of an ocean, a presence, cold, distant, unmoved by the warp's hatred. Angron felt it watching him. His lip curled. A god of another world? The nails howled in response. He could almost hear them snarl as if sensing an equal. He rose to his full height, towering above the demon altars, muscles plated with brass and scar tissue. His armor was a ruin of ancient craftsmanship, barely recognizable as once human design. The sigil of the World Eaters burned faintly across his chest, a scar over a scar. He turned toward the sky. There were no stars above his world, only a blood-red glare, eternal and unchanging. But tonight, it was broken. A streak of white light burned through the crimson clouds, carving a perfect line across the sky before vanishing. Not warp light, not demon fire, something pure, something wrong. He laughed then, a sound that made his warband clutch their ears in agony. "Another challenger," he said. "Another god who thinks itself worthy." The nails dug deeper into his skull, burning every nerve, every thought, until his mind was only one voice, the voice that had defined him since Nuceria. Kill, prove break. He took a step forward, and the world responded. The ground split open beneath his feet, rivers of molten brass spewing upward. His warbands roared in unison, some out of worship, some in terror. Angron didn't care. He spread his arms as if to embrace the storm. "Come then," he shouted into the void. "Show me this silence that dares to challenge me." In orbit above the demon world, the air tore. Not like a warp breach. It was surgical, precise, a pinhole in reality itself. And from that pinhole descended light, cold blue blinding. Angron's roar shook the heavens. The nails screamed, the warp bled, but the light did not fade. It expanded. When it touched the ground, it burned through everything. The demons, the banners, even the ground itself, without leaving ash. It didn't destroy. It erased. The air went still again. When the glare dimmed, a shape stood at the crater's center. A man. Tall, slim, hands in pockets, hair white as the snows of Terra's poles, eyes hidden behind a blindfold that shimmered like glass in sunlight. He smiled. "Guess this isn't Shinjuku anymore." The nails throbbed once. Then Angron screamed, not in pain but in recognition. That quiet, that presence, that defiance of the warp itself. It was him. And for the first time since his damnation, the Butcher of Nuceria felt his heartbeat slow. Not in calm, in anticipation, he hefted his axe, and the world trembled. The silence did not break, it deepened. Not the numb kind of silence born of reverence or aftermath, but the smothering, preternatural stillness that came before a predator's strike. Even the warp, that ever-screaming tide of demons, howls, and hungry gods recoiled from it. Where the blue light had landed, nothing familiar remained. Not the stench of brass and blood, nor the electric heat of Korn's ray. It was as though the laws of this place had rewritten themselves around the figure in the crater. And still he smiled. Gojo Satoru. He didn't wear armor. Didn't carry a bolter, a chain blade, a demon-etched weapon from the dark forges of heresy. His strength wasn't advertised through machinery or monstrous size, but Angron felt it, like a barrier between realities. The warp couldn't see into him, couldn't touch him. Gojo tilted his head, blindfold shimmering with silver pulses as though reading a world that couldn't read him back. "So this is Warhammer," he murmured. "Looks like hell. Smells worse." He stepped forward, and the ground beneath his foot did not crunch or burn. It refused to react. Even the cursed land of Canon Prime, a world that fed on agony and blood, found no purchase in him. Angron stood at the far end of a shattered Prometheum field 1/2 kilometer across. Between them, the remnants of a demon city, the once great Canon Prime, capital of ritual warbands and flesh forges. Now it was a hollowed ruin, its buildings twisted as if caught mid-scream. Roads melted into rivers of rusted bone, banners of skin flapped above towers made from the flayed columns of slain Astartes. None of it mattered. The planet itself recoiled from the blue glow around the intruder. Gojo stopped in the center of the dead city, scanning the skyline. Thought there'd be more people. Angron didn't respond with words. He stepped into the city. Each of his strides cracked the earth. Brass steam hissed from the vents in his spine. The nails in his skull drove deeper, forcing rage through his body like a second bloodstream. But even that storm wavered. His vision twisted, not blurred but distorted, like the world had folded around Gojo without warning. He gritted his fanged teeth and pushed forward. Buildings collapsed in his wake, not from violence, just from proximity. The gravity of his hate was enough to bring walls to their knees. Gojo didn't move. A single white hair shifted in a breeze that no longer blew. The two figures, one a mountain of immortal rage, the other a man with his hands in his pockets, stood face to face across a line of shattered bones. Gojo's voice was casual, but it cut clean through the warp's growl. "You're the angry one, right?" "Angron?" The Primarch said nothing, but the sky bled in answer. Above, brass clouds ruptured. Warp lightning arced in patterns that formed skulls. Demons screamed in tongues too ancient for mortals. The entire world reared like a beast about to charge. And then Gojo smiled wider. "Yeah," he said, "you'll do." Angron moved. The space between them vanished. There was no running, no build-up, no roar, just impact. Gojo raised a single finger. The axe came down and stopped, not with force, not with resistance, with nothing. The edge of the weapon, engraved with the names of 10,000 dead worlds, hung in the air a hair's breadth from Gojo's blindfold, suspended, as though space itself had betrayed Angron. The demon Primarch growled, pushing harder. His muscles swelled, his armor screamed, his very being poured hate into the blow. Nothing. Gojo cocked his head. "You done?" Then casually he stepped back. Angron stumbled, not out of weakness but surprise. The weight of his own strike slammed into the earth behind Gojo, tearing a crater into the city's core. Buildings collapsed. Demon glyphs shattered, and still Gojo stood untouched. Angron looked up. What he saw made his vision flicker red. The barrier, it wasn't a shield, not like the psychic defenses of a librarian or the warp-fed armor of a demon prince. It was something else entirely, a mathematical principle, a concept, an infinity between them. Every time he moved, Every time the nails screamed, every strike he launched, it would never reach. Not truly. Gojo raised a hand lazily. Let me show you what it feels like. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Angron's body lifted, just a few inches. But it was enough. A god of rage thrown by a flick of the wrist. He landed with the force of a meteor, carving a trench through the heart of Charon Prime. Demon warbands who had dared approach were atomized in the aftermath. When he rose, eyes glowing like suns, his voice was ragged with laughter. Good. The ground wept blood. You can fight. Gojo vanished. He didn't move. He was simply somewhere else. A hand touched Angron's back. Whispers echoed. Then Gojo spoke. Round 2. And the sky exploded. There was no sound at first, only the absence of it. Not silence, but the kind of void that made silence jealous. The kind that swallowed screams before they were born. The warp howled across the galaxy like a wounded beast, and yet in this place, in this moment, there was only stillness. Angron had never known restraint. Never believed in the quiet between blows, in strategy that did not begin and end with blood. His body was forged for war, his soul built of rupture. But as he rose from the burning trench carved into the flesh of Charon Prime, even he paused, not for fear, not even for awe, but for recognition. This wasn't sorcery, not the trickery of Tzinch, nor the shielding rituals of the Eldar. Gojo's defense had no scent of promethium or the metallic tang of hexagrammic wards. What wrapped around him was an idea made real, a law written into the bones of space, and Gojo? He stood without tension, not braced for the next blow, not poised like a duelist. He simply existed, perfectly centered, as if every atom of his being knew it was exactly where it belonged. Angron charged again. The ground broke underfoot, air peeled back in sonic tears. No creature in the galaxy could match his momentum, no mortal, no Astartes, no abomination born of flesh or warp. But Gojo didn't move. Again and again, each blow met the void. Not resistance, not redirection, just separation, like trying to strike a star from a million light years away. Still, the city died for their duel. Towers made of bone and warp steel collapsed as collateral. Skulls turned to dust. The few demon hosts that had survived began to scatter, their ancient instincts screaming in ways even they didn't understand. Angron was shouting now, not words but fury, screams not from his mouth but his blood. His armor cracked at the edges from the pressure of his own rage. His eyes, once twin volcanoes, now flickered with doubt. And for the first time in his monstrous existence, he asked, not aloud but in the hollow of his cursed mind, "What are you?" Gojo heard it. His answer came like ice across a burning planet. "I'm the strongest." But it wasn't arrogance. Not quite. Not the false bravado of conquerors or demagogues. It was a statement of fact, like the pull of gravity, like the speed of light, a constant. The sky opened again, not with warp energy this time, but something far stranger. Stars appeared, real ones, distant, ancient. A breach in the planet's corruption revealed the heavens as they were meant to be. For one moment, the cosmos looked down on Charon Prime, not with contempt or fury, but with awareness. And Gojo stood beneath them, framed not by fire but by clarity. Angron could not understand it. His brain, engineered and mutated and drowned in the butcher's nails, sought a threat it could not touch. His soul, long since torn by Khorne's grip, strained to reject what it could not rage against. His nature, destruction incarnate, was rebelling against reality itself. But something deeper had shifted. The god of rage had found an opponent who did not scream. Even the Emperor had screamed. On Nuceria, During the final lashings of defiance, during the 1,000 betrayals of the heresy, he had screamed if only within the warp. All things screamed eventually, but not this one, and that was unbearable. Angron rushed again, but this time he didn't swing. He roared, the full weight of his being unleashed, not at Gojo but at the world itself. The ground cracked in tectonic rifts, red light bled from beneath. The planet groaned. The nails sang their siren shriek. And Gojo led him. Waited. Until the moment Angron was nothing but forward motion. Until the god of war was nothing but impulse. Then Gojo stepped through space, not moved, rewrote, and stood behind Angron, whispered, "You lost the moment you screamed." Then he touched the Primarch's back, and every law that had governed this place, this fight, this world folded, not broken, just turned inside out. Angron collapsed, not from pain, not even defeat, but confusion. His body hit the stone. The nails tried to drive him into rage again, but they found no hook. For one impossible instant, the demon Primarch of Khorne felt something he did not understand. Not submission, not fear, stillness. Gojo didn't strike again. He walked away. Each footstep restored the laws around him. Gravity, light, even the warp, slithering and feral, was cautious now. He spoke, not looking back. "I don't kill for fun." The warp snarled at that. 1,000 demon eyes blinked open across the sky. A scream distant and subterranean split the crust of Charon Prime, and something old began to rise. Angron, dazed and bleeding ichor onto stone, growled through broken fangs, "You let me live?" Gojo paused. "I'm not done with you," he said, eyes glowing blue beneath his blindfold, "and you're not done with yourself." Then the city shook, because the planet had heard enough. The crust of Charon Prime cracked like bone under pressure. Not from orbital bombardment, not from macro cannon impacts, but from something beneath. Something old, older than Angron's fury, older than Terra's sorrow. Something forged not in the warp, but in that forgotten silence before the first scream. Gojo felt it before the others. He always did. A tremor through reality, not of tectonics, but of intent. Like a question forming behind a locked door, like a memory pressing its face against the mirror of the present. His fingers closed reflexively, not out of fear, but calculation. Angron stood again, not because his body was whole. It wasn't. Not because the butcher's nails demanded it. They did. But because the thing rising from below demanded an answer. And Angron had never walked away from a question written in blood. The ground peeled open like flesh. Chasms vomited heat and void in equal measure. From the deepest fissure, chains rose, titanic, rusted, heavy with meaning. They weren't bound to metal or demon, they were concepts held in form. Each link was carved with languages lost to even the Black Library, symbols that shifted as you watched them. Glyphs that screamed when remembered. 1,000 civilizations had died forging those chains, and none had ever known why. Now they returned to memory. Angron snarled, stepping forward, crimson armor scorched and cracked, ichor pooling in his wake. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, not from pain but disuse. "I know this smell." Gojo raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Angron didn't answer. He couldn't. There were no words for it, no lexicon in low Gothic or high that could hold what now stirred, because this wasn't a weapon. It was a prison that had failed, and now what it held was waking. The warp recoiled, not in fear but in reverence. Demons screamed and fled, not toward the eye but away from it. Some clawed at the edges of reality itself, seeking escape. Others simply vanished, reduced to memory ash by a presence too vast for names. Gojo blinked. His infinity domain flared like a second sun for just a heartbeat. Whatever lay beneath the planet, it wasn't bound by his rules. It acknowledged his laws the way a storm acknowledges a candle, without malice but with indifference. Angron began to laugh. It was broken, echoing, jagged, a sound that once heralded the death of cities. Now it trembled with something else, not joy, not madness, recognition. "The chains!" he said, voice cracking. "They weren't for me." Gojo glanced back, wind whipping around them, light warping into unnatural blues and greens. "Then who?" And the answer came, not in words, in presence. The void between the chains pulsed, a single heartbeat, not loud, not thunderous, but final. The air stilled, the warp stilled, even Angron stopped. And something opened, not a portal, not a rift, a lid, like a sarcophagus the size of a continent, or a thought buried too deep for history to remember. From the darkness within, something rose, not fast, but with certainty. A form half submerged in shadow, wrapped in something older than cloth, not robes, not armor, something in between, something binding. Chains coiled around it like serpents, not to restrain, to anchor. A face veiled and broken, eyes that never blinked, not because they were blind, but because blinking would release them. And in that moment, Gojo understood. This wasn't the birth of a new player. It was the return of a forgotten rule, a being that predated the war in heaven, that had watched the old ones play with stars and laughed without sound. A fragment of balance left behind, buried beneath Charon Prime while empires rose and burned above its prison. Angron dropped to one knee, not in worship, but in sheer gravitational weight. His body wasn't designed to yield, but this was no longer about design. Gojo stayed upright, barely. His domain flickered, lines of blue unraveling, rewriting, spiraling into kaleidoscopic entropy. He spoke, not to Angron, not to the thing in chains, but to himself. "I'm not the strongest anymore, am I?" No one answered. The thing rose higher. Now its hands were visible, not clawed, not armored, just hands, human in shape, inhuman in meaning. Each finger bore a ring, one for each dead pantheon, one for each truth forgotten by the galaxy, and in its left palm, suspended like a dying star, a fragment of something Gojo had only ever read about in demon-bound scrolls, a piece of the first chain, the one that held the nameless, the one forged before the Imperium had gravity, and it was cracking. Angron growled, fingers clawing at stone, struggling to stand. "We can't let it break." Gojo didn't look away. "Then you'd better start fighting like someone who wants to live." And from deep within the planet, from a voice that had never known language, a whisper formed. "Release me." The air shuddered, and the first chain snapped. The sound of the first chain snapping did not echo. It resonated, across orbital strata, through the bones of Charon Prime, and into the spines of those who still clung to the illusion that they understood reality. It wasn't a noise, it was a verdict. Something had been decided, and none who heard it were invited to object. Gojo closed his eyes for less than a second, and in that second his mind saw too much. A vision not forced, but offered. Like a gift from a being that didn't barter in dreams, but in truth. Not prophetic, not symbolic, just what was. He saw the origin of war, not a battle, not a campaign. But the actual moment conflict was born, when the first duality in existence realized it could disagree with itself. That's what this thing was. Not a god, not a devil, a disagreement made manifest. The rule of one, a law older than physics, that no matter how many names exist, no matter how many thrones are built, there is always one final authority, and it had been buried, not slain, not by the old ones, not by the necrontyr, but by consensus, the belief that maybe reality didn't need to remember its first tyrant. But memory is a coward. And the rule remembered everything. Gojo's voice was hoarse now. "We're not dealing with a demon. We're not dealing with anything that should have a name." Angron rose slowly, shaking off dust like an earthquake brushing aside clouds. His breath came in ragged steam. "No, this isn't new. It's just..." Back the being in chains did not move further. It didn't need to. Its awareness expanded, without motion, without effort, as if all it had been waiting for was that first fracture. The one chain that signaled the pact of containment had been broken by permission. In orbit, Imperial augurs went blind. Astartes vessels lost Auspec's clarity, drifting as if drowned in ink. Warp-voided communication broke into shrieking binary liturgies. Choir psychers bled through the nose and collapsed into fitful chanting. And far beneath Terra's throne, somewhere within the hollow echo of the Emperor's breath, a single custodian whispered without understanding why. He rises. Back on Charon Prime, Angron began to run. He didn't warn Gojo, didn't call out. There was no time, no strategy. He simply moved, armor screaming, blades drawn, blood still steaming from the wounds Gojo had left earlier. But none of that mattered now, because Angron was no longer fighting for himself. He was fighting to delay the rule of one, to delay obedience. Gojo followed. He wasn't built to run from things, but this wasn't retreat. It was redirection. He leapt beside Angron, matching the demon Primarch stride for stride as they tore through shifting gravity fields and fields of buckling stone. Around them, reality changed its mind about distance. The world contorted, geometry bent like a pinion. Behind them, the veiled figure did not pursue. It didn't need to, because already the rules were bending. Gojo's limitless field trembled. The infinite gap between him and his enemies started to stutter. Not because the domain was weakening, but because the concept of distance itself was being renegotiated. "I can't hold this," he muttered. "You don't need to," Angron growled. "We're not going to fight it." Gojo turned mid-sprint, shocked. "You? Saying don't fight?" Angron didn't smile. His eyes burned with something worse than fire, clarity. "I don't fight concepts. I kill them." And the path ended. A cliff face, thousands of meters high, broken by seismic shift. Below, the boiling crust of Charon Prime threatened to collapse inward, a sun being born from the bones of a dead world. Above them, a shrine. No, a cathedral. Built sideways into the sky, its spires bending like vines upward into orbit, anchored by technology that hadn't existed since before humanity had names for light. It wasn't Imperial. It wasn't Xenos. It was antediluvian, carved by an unknown faith into the very concept of retreat. Gojo looked up, and the chains were converging. Hundreds of them, like arms seeking something, not to imprison but to reconnect, like a severed limb seeking a lost heartbeat. And at the highest spire something glowed, a sphere, golden, burning with the same hue as the Emperor's flame. But it was not the Astronomicon, it was something else, a counterweight. Gojo understood. "This was the lock," he whispered. Angron's nostrils flared. "And that thing behind us?" It was the key. The rule of one did not speak, but Gojo felt it, like a thought that wasn't his, a message carved into the space between their atoms. "I have returned." The sky fractured. Not with lightning, with decision. It rained ash and intent. It was neither storm nor blessing, just the end of ambiguity. A single law, only one throne, only one ruler. Everything else is a lie. And then the chains snapped again. Not behind them, not below, above. The golden sphere shattered into 1,000 concepts, each one a law, a truth, a moral code, and one by one they died. The rule of one had unchained itself, and now it was time for the galaxy to kneel. There were no stars left. Gojo looked up and saw only veils, shimmering membranes of impossible thickness like skin stretched across the void between real and unreal. The sky had folded inward. The galaxy had blinked. And in that blink, something ancient and unforgiving had been allowed to look back. He stumbled, not from pain, not from exhaustion, but from the sudden awareness that there were no thrones left to pray to. He could no longer feel terror, could no longer taste the psychic golden breath of the Emperor through the veil of war. The Astronomicon had not dimmed, it had been muted, as if an entire galaxy of prayers had been funneled into silence, not destroyed, just deemed irrelevant. A new rule had been written, and this one did not require hope. Angron didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. His gait was different now. Less fury, more inevitability, like a beast that had accepted its death, but decided to bite the sun before fading. He paused before the remains of the golden sphere's vault, staring into the dust cloud with narrowed eyes. The chains lay coiled like dead serpents, their psychic heat still rising into the air, warping the stones into grotesque runes. "They chained it," he finally said, "and called that peace." Gojo knelt beside one of the shattered links, pressing a finger against its edge. Even broken, it resisted. The metal, if it was metal, recoiled from his touch as if offended by his existence. This wasn't a binding instrument, it was a vow, a litany written in matter. "This was made by something human," he muttered. Angron laughed bitterly. "No, it was made by something that hated humans even more than it feared them." They both turned as the mountain rumbled again. Not from behind, not from below, but from above. Something was descending, or unfolding, like an origami truth pulling itself out of a lie. The space above the broken shrine tore with absolute silence. From it emerged a figure, not the rule itself, not the chained horror, but something born of it. A herald, not cloaked, not armored, just bare. Human almost, white-eyed, mouth sealed shut by threads of golden language, skin tattooed in symbols that changed as you looked at them. Inquisitorial, Aeldari, Necron sigils, the Imperial Aquila, even the black sun of the Interrex, all false, all fleeting. The only constant was its silence. Angron stepped forward. The being raised a hand. Time stopped. Gojo felt it in the marrow. His body didn't freeze. It continued moving, but not forward, not backward, just within itself, like being stuck between frames of a film. He tried to speak, and the words came out after his mouth moved. "What is this?" The being didn't answer. It didn't need to. Gojo understood. This was not communication, this was judgment. The Emperor was not dead. But the concept of needing him had been placed on trial. Angron bared his teeth. "No thrones! No chains, just rules pretending they're gods." He roared and charged. The being didn't defend itself. It simply blinked. And Angron vanished. Gojo gasped. No blood, no flash of light, no scream, just absence. A red absence. His mind screamed, reaching out into the psychic ether. And then he heard it. Not with ears, but memory. Angron wasn't dead. He had been unwritten. Gojo stood alone now, before a being that didn't exist in any codex, not Xeno, not demon, not machine. It was the embodiment of the new truth, that the age of gods was over and only laws remained. But Gojo didn't kneel. His limitless domain stuttered, flickering at the edges like a candle in a vacuum. He reached into his coat, pulled free a small strip of parchment. Not a talisman, not a weapon, just a name, handwritten. "Vulcan," he whispered it once, and the sky remembered fire. Across the sector, a surge of heat erupted. Not warp-based, not technological, just presence. The herald turned, and then it hesitated. That was enough. The chain at Gojo's feet snapped again, but this time it wasn't from pressure. It was from choice. The galaxy was no longer obeying, not yet rebelling, but considering the alternative. And from the west, riding on pillars of Prometheum-fed flame, something approached. Not a Primarch, not a god, just a man who refused to be written out. And Gojo smiled. Because the sky was no longer emperorless. It was angry. He did not fall from the sky. He rose, carried by pillars of fire that did not scorch, wings of promethium that did not burn. The flames moved around him as if obeying memory itself. Each flicker of light sang a different story, a forge lit under siege, a brother's cry lost in cinders, a world burned to save another. Gojo stood still. Even the silent herald tilted its head. Vulcan had returned, but not as a god. There were no horns on his brow, no divine aura humming behind his eyes. He wore no crown. His armor, blackened and cracked in places, still bore the unmistakable marks of the 18th Legion, flame motifs, hammer crests, the subtle promise of rebirth through destruction, but his eyes held something neither demon nor angel could replicate. Grief, ancient, unyielding. Grief carved into bone, layered over centuries of war and sacrifice, and beneath it all, hope. Not naive, not shining, burnt hope, scarred but alive. He stepped between Gojo and the herald, not with defiance, but with mourning. "You're early," Vulcan said to the silent creature. "This age isn't done yet." The herald did not move. Its threads of golden language began to glow. A halo of anti-light pulsed from its skull, symbols rearranging in fractal configurations too fast for comprehension. Vulcan glanced sideways at Gojo. "You're not from here." "No, but you stayed." Gojo shrugged. "Didn't like the way they break their toys." Vulcan smiled, barely. "Then you've already done more than most." He turned to the herald, raising one arm slowly. From his gauntlet emerged the haft of a weapon that was never truly gone. Dawnbringer, not a warhammer, not a relic, but a promise remade in steel and flame. The herald responded by stepping forward, and the entire plateau cracked. It wasn't aggression, it was gravity. Not mass, but narrative gravity. The weight of everything it represented. The closing of accounts, the judgment of false gods, the final chapter of myth. But Vulcan did not retreat. "Stories," he said, "are not made to end in silence." He swung. Dawnbringer moved not like a weapon, but like a sunrise. It tore the air, split the sky, fractured the membrane of unreality above them. The blow didn't land on the herald's flesh. It struck the idea of finality, and for a moment reality screamed. Gojo fell to one knee. His six eyes flared, and in that flash he saw everything, a world where the Emperor fell at Ulanor and Horus rose unchallenged. A world where Angron sat on Terra's throne, blood-drunk and worshipped. A world where Vulcan never came back. Where hope remained just a rumor. But none of those were this world. This world had chosen rebellion. The herald staggered, its symbols misaligned, its mouth, sealed for eons, split slightly open, not wide. Just enough for one breath, a sigh of inevitability. And then it screamed. It was not sound. It was reality unraveling. Trees melted into equations, sky curled into numbers, the stars turned to clock hands. Time became a curse. Gojo screamed back, not words, just presence, and somehow that was enough. The herald faltered. Vulcan raised his hammer once more, but not to strike, to signal. The mountain behind them erupted, not in lava, but in memory. Flames poured upward from the vaults of Terra, each licking tendril carrying the names of the forgotten. Salamanders, guardsmen, sisters, artisans, all those who died believing they were part of something more. Their names burned like banners. And the galaxy remembered. Not glory, but sacrifice, the herald recoiled. It wasn't dying. It couldn't die. It was a truth given shape, a logic-born child of the warped silence. But it could fail. It could be told. Not yet. And in that moment it understood. Vulcan stepped forward, hammer lowered. "You were meant to come when the last forge went cold," he whispered. "But it still burns." He pointed to Gojo, who stood trembling but unbroken. "And he is not even of this world." Yet he stood. The herald blinked and vanished. No flash, no warping, just gone. Gojo exhaled. The air tasted like metal and crushed time. Vulcan looked to the sky. The veils had not parted, but they had dimmed. "That was not the end," he said. "It was the warning." Gojo wiped blood from his chin. "What now?" "We wait." "For what?" Vulcan looked back to the scorched chains, now cooling in the dust. His gaze was heavy. "For the next lie." Because the rule had not been destroyed, only delayed. The herald had vanished. But absence does not always mean defeat. In the stillness that followed, the sky did not clear. The clouds remained the color of rusted iron, as if memory itself had stained them. Wind moved across the plateau, cold and sharp, carrying no scent but that of ash. Beneath their feet, the chains, the ones that had bound nothing yet threatened everything, lay dormant, not broken, just sleeping. Gojo walked among them, his steps hesitant. His body still bore the fractures of battle, though he moved like a man whose purpose had eclipsed his pain. His robes were torn, his face bloodied, but his eyes burned with clarity. 6 eyes staring through every falsehood the universe could conjure. Vulcan knelt at the chains, his hand, armored in obsidian and promethium-scarred metal, brushed against a link wider than a rhino's tread. The texture was wrong. Not iron, not steel, something older, something that remembered the sound of gods being born and the screams of forgotten wars. "These were never meant to bind anything," he said. Gojo raised an eyebrow. "They're not shackles. They're warnings, left by the ones who came before, or maybe by the Emperor himself when he still dreamed." Gojo walked closer. "Warnings of what?" Vulcan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pressed his palm to the cold surface. A faint tremor ran through the ground, as if somewhere beneath Terra's crust something vast had shifted. "They remember," he murmured. Gojo knelt beside him. "Chains that remember?" Vulcan nodded. "Everything in this world has been bent by war, but not all of it was forged by man or Xeno. Some of it is deeper, like the mountain." Gojo frowned. "What mountain?" Vulcan smiled faintly. "The one that breathes beneath Nocturne. The one we never mined. We built our fortress around it but never disturbed it. We called it Mount Deathfire, but its true name was never ours to know." Gojo looked again at the chains. Something in their form had shifted subtly. The patterns on their surface now resembled not just links, but glyphs. Glyphs of fire, glyphs of blood, glyphs of choice. And then they pulsed. Only once. But it was enough. Both men froze. Far in the distance, beyond the haze, past the broken Manufactorum ruins and half-collapsed Aquila spires, a new sound began to echo. A low, rhythmic thrum. Not mechanical, not demonic. Something older than both. The earth was remembering. Vulcan stood. "They'll come now," he said. "Who?" "All of them. Custodians, inquisitors, maybe even the High Lords, if any still dare show their faces." Gojo stood beside him, frowning. "Why?" "Because they'll want to bind it again. They always do. Anything they can't understand, they chain. Anything that moves without order, they cage. It is the Imperium's first instinct, but that instinct is a poison now." Gojo looked again at the chains, now humming softly beneath the soil. "You're saying the real threat wasn't the herald?" Vulcan turned his gaze to the sky, where the auroras of the warp still shimmered faintly, like wounds that refused to close. "The herald was just the bell," he said. "The tolling of the last age." "The real danger is what the bell awakens." Gojo's fists clenched. "Then we should destroy the chains." "No." "Why not?" "Because you don't destroy memories. You learn from them." Gojo turned away, pacing toward the edge of the plateau. The planet below looked different now. No longer just battleground. It was stage and tomb. It was story and sin. It was home, even to those who never chose it. "Then what do we do?" he asked quietly. Vulcan answered without hesitation. "We choose." Gojo turned. "What?" "We choose what happens next." Not them. Not the rules. Not the machines, or the myths, or the gods. Us, he raised Dawnbringer once more, not to strike, but to ignite. The hammer flared, casting deep orange light across the plateau. The chains shimmered in its reflection, their edges no longer sharp, but almost alive. "And if they come?" Gojo asked. "They will. And if they try to chain us too?" Vulcan smiled. "Then we show them what fire remembers." The words hung there, heavy, eternal, because fire does not forget, it merely waits. They came as expected, golden hulls cracking the horizon like thunderheads, custodian grav transports roaring down from orbit in silence born of judgment. The echo of their approach rumbled not just in air, but in the bones of those who still walked Terra. These were not reinforcements. They were an answer, a declaration. As their ships touched down near the plateau, the chains reacted, not with panic, but purpose. Their humming sharpened, tuning into the harmonics of the arriving presence like instruments awakening to an old conductor. Glyphs began to flicker, warp fire green and sun gold, neither blasphemous nor divine. They were symbols of an age too far removed for purity. Gojo stood at the edge, arms folded, watching the armored giants emerge. Tall even by Astartes standards, clad in auramite that shone with the full fury of artificial suns, the custodian guard advanced like lions unleashed. Yet their weapons were not raised, not yet. One among them walked forward alone, a warrior without helm. His face was sculpted in marble stillness, but his eyes betrayed age, a mind sharpened by war and dulled by politics. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but filled with weight. "Lord Vulcan." The salamander Primarch turned, no surprise on his face, only acceptance. "Constantin Valdor," he replied, not a question. The custodian nodded. "You were not expected to return." "I never left," Vulcan said, "only waited." Valdor's eyes moved to the chains, then to Gojo. His gaze narrowed slightly as if seeking something that didn't belong in the weave of fate. "You brought a foreigner." Gojo smiled without warmth. "I brought fire." The custodians behind Valdor shifted. One clicked a bolt gun into place, another activated a scanning field, yet none moved forward. "What lies beneath," Valdor said, voice still calm, "cannot be allowed to rise." "It's already rising," Vulcan said, "and not because of him. Not because of me. Because the Imperium forgot what it meant to serve the living. Not just the dead, you speak of rebellion. I speak of remembering, the kind of fire that reforges. Not just incinerates." Valdor's tone chilled. "That path leads to ruin. Do you seek to walk the steps of Horus?" Vulcan stepped closer. Dawnbringer lowered, but its glow intensified. "Horus sought dominion. I seek renewal. That distinction is meaningless in the eyes of the throne. Then the throne sees wrongly." A beat of silence. Even the chains fell quiet, listening. Valdor did not flinch, but he knew. Deep in the clockwork of his gene-modified mind, he sensed it. The war was no longer about weapons, it was about will. Vulcan turned to Gojo. "We can't force them to see. But we can show them the choice." Gojo nodded, understanding. They walked to the center of the plateau where the chains converged. Vulcan raised Dawnbringer. Gojo summoned the convergence of his cursed energy, forming twin orbs of light and gravity in his palms. The custodians raised their weapons. Valdor raised his hand. No. He stepped forward alone. His golden spear touched the soil. The earth did not crack, but opened. A fissure, clean and precise, and from it rose, not flame, not warp, but memory, images suspended in light, the burning of Kalth, the defense of Armageddon, the last stand of Cadia, the birth of Guilliman's Indomitus crusade, and older still, fragments of the Great Crusade, of unity before betrayal, of purpose before stagnation, the past made visible. Vulcan lowered his hammer. This, he said, is what lies beneath. Gojo stepped into the light. The images reacted to him. Some flared, some dimmed. He felt not judgment, but curiosity. The galaxy was asking who he was. He answered with silence, letting it speak back. Valdor looked to Vulcan, finally uncertain. And if it judges us unworthy? Vulcan looked skyward. Then we burn with it, and rise again, not as tyrants, not as ghosts, but as men who remember what fire is for. The chains pulsed once more, then fractured, not destroyed, freed not to bind but to illuminate. Across Terra something shifted, shrines flickered, vox grills stuttered, and somewhere in the golden throne chamber itself, a single servitor paused, just long enough for a whisper to echo through its soulless shell. He watches but says nothing, not yet. No footfall echoed louder than silence in the throne chamber, and no silence was more profound than the one that greeted the Custodes' return. The doors had opened for Valdor alone, as they always had. A hiss of hypermechanics, a whisper of blessed steel. He stepped into the sanctuary of the Imperium's beating heart, the Astronomican chamber where the God Emperor sat unmoved, unbreathing, but never unknowing. All around him the mechanisms labored. Thousands of psychers died their sanctioned deaths in perfect harmony, feeding the blinding star of humanity's navigational light. The air smelled of ozone and dried incense, of burnt soul and sanctified decay. Every breath was like swallowing a prayer carved into rusted gold. The golden throne loomed. Its sheer scale had always dwarfed reason, but in this moment, after witnessing what had unfolded on the surface, after speaking with the Primarch who had defied extinction, after seeing the eyes of a man named Gojo pierce the metaphysical veil, Valdor felt for the first time that the throne did not just hold a body. It held the galaxy together, and perhaps it strained under that weight. He stood at the perimeter where no sound reached the entity once called Emperor. Yet he spoke. They came back not to rebel, Valdor said quietly, but to warn. The fire is rising, not from chaos, from memory, from what we were. No response, only the hum of tortured eternity. Valdor looked up, eyes meeting that silent face. Was it even still a man, a machine, a tethered god? They will ask questions soon. Vulcan, Guilliman, perhaps even the lion, they will look beyond the veil, and if they find nothing but fire and silence. He paused. What should they build? The golden throne crackled just once, a flicker of energy, imperceptible to most, but not to him. He turned away, not because he feared it, but because he understood what it meant. Gojo, now housed within an Inquisition-secured district under permanent watch, sat beneath a shattered sky mural. Custodians lined the chamber like pillars of gold in suspicion, but he sat cross-legged, eyes half-lidded, waiting. The door hissed. Vulcan entered, not as a prisoner, not as a rebel, but as a man no longer waiting to be judged. Gojo looked up. So, Vulcan lowered himself to sit opposite. He didn't speak, but he listened. Gojo smirked. That's more than most kings, more than most gods, Vulcan said. Silence followed, but it was warm now, like cooling metal after the forge. Beyond them, the city of Terra remained unchanged. The towers still spat smog and prayer. The manufactora still bled fire. The underhive still echoed with the desperation of billions. But somewhere in the machinery something had altered. Not broken, shifted. Not enough for most to notice, not yet. But change rarely begins with armies. It begins with eyes, with one custodian questioning silence, with one Primarch refusing extinction, with one outsider who did not kneel, and far beneath them all, bound to circuitry and light, the throne dreamed without sleep. Perhaps if there was anything left of the man beneath the mask of divinity, he too remembered a time when fire meant rebirth, and not just annihilation. The galaxy did not change that day, but it inhaled, a breath held before the next word, before the next war, before the next truth. And somewhere, across the warp-flayed stars, the Imperium blinked, not in anger, not in hunger, but in anticipation. Because even gods must choose what kind of fire they become.